Hey everyone, and welcome to a new episode of BobBoom. This episode is going to be a bit of a tutorial. I don't want my channel to be nothing but rants, so I'm going to go over how easy it is to build your own computer. I mean, it is absurdly easy in this day and age where technology surrounds us. You can pretty much find it anywhere, and building a computer is as easy as just online shopping. And I don't mean going to a website that already has them predetermined and then you just select things. What if you actually wanted to build it part for part? And that's kind of I guess the fun and exciting aspect of building a computer. So, I'm going to go over the basics of what you need for your computer, and I'm going to help put it in layman's terms by describing what the computer parts are compared to what a human being is. Because a computer is a lot like a human being in some regards. So let's get started. This should show a recording of my amazing Microsoft Paint skills, but if it doesn't, uh, let me know. Okay, when you look at a computer, what's the first thing that you notice? What's really the first thing that you notice? When you walk into a room, what's the first thing that you notice? The case. The case is a very, very important part of the computer. You don't want it to be too small and you don't want it to be too large. It doesn't necessarily have to be in that just right area. It doesn't need to be amazingly specific. It just needs to have enough room to fit all the parts that you're going to be putting into it. Uh, a case is very important because it also kind of creates a vacuum in there. All the fans and stuff like that. Some people uh, don't dust out their computers and things like that. Well, you need to, because air comes in from the front usually, and then air leaves out the back. The air going through the case helps cool down all the parts. But because it's bringing in the air, it also brings in dust. So always dust your computers. So now that we have a case, this is a lot like, I guess, a skeleton, or in this case, an exoskeleton. It helps hold all the major components in place so they don't wiggle around, they're not flopping all around the place, stuff like that, like your actual skeleton does. It helps hold everything up. One of the major parts that a computer needs, in fact, every computer needs it other than anything that might be analog, is a power supply. Now, a power supply is a lot like the heart. It has a whole bunch of wires coming from it and things like that, things that power every other part on the computer system. It's plugged into usually an outlet and things like that. These things can range from $80 to $600 depending on how many watts and things like that you have. But to make this tutorial something kind of easy, at least on a beginner intermediate level, I'm going to say that most computers, if you plan on getting cheaper ended parts, you kind of only need a 450 watt power supply. Not that big a deal. They usually run between, 50 to 150 bucks. If that. So now that we got the heart out the way, we need to think about information. We need to think about where all the information's going, how's it being transferred, and things like that. So we're going to have to get ourselves a motherboard. Now, a motherboard seems like it's very complex because when you look at a motherboard of a computer, it's covered in a whole bunch of capacitors and a whole bunch of other like little prickly things and stuff like stuff that you definitely don't want to bend or touch or break, and it looks very overwhelmingly fragile and dangerous, and you just don't want to screw with it. And that's understandable. The motherboard is a very important part, but don't be confused. It's just a square or sometimes a rectangle that fits the CPU, and everything just connects to it. That's it. You don't need to worry about everything else that's on it. You never really have to worry about all the other crazy things prickling out on it. Just make sure not to break it or bend it, and as long as it's screwed into what the case is, the exoskeleton, you won't really have to worry about it all that much. The motherboard make sure that everything is connecting and communicating with one another. So you got power going to it, and then you're going to have sometimes power coming out of the motherboard. It's connected to everything in the computer. It's kind of like the spine, right? The spine on a human body transfers information to the rest of the body parts from the brain. Now, a motherboard, in case you really need to know, there's not really a whole lot of different sizes for motherboards, the same way that they are with cases, but you generally want to get a motherboard that'll match the size of the case. There are different terminologies. There's ATX, micro ATX, things like that. Those are the things that you need to look out for. But a motherboard probably should run should run you about $100. Not that big a deal, right? Most $100 motherboards, hell, they're even cheaper than that. But my price range, what I tend to get for a motherboard, just because I want something a little bit more up to date, $100. They're not really all that scary or expensive. The scary, expensive part is what's coming up next. This is called the CPU. The CPU is a very vital and sometimes expensive part of your computer. The CPU is a lot like the brain. It uses the electricity coming from the power supply, and it gathers all the information that's being input and it works how to output it back. So like when you're moving the mouse around, the CPU is working. When you're opening and closing programs, CPU is working. When you're just using something as simple as a calculator, the CPU is working. The CPU is constantly working, constantly thinking, the same way I hope most human beings are, but of course, that's giving humanity too much credit sometimes. Most CPUs can be kind of expensive. The CPU can vary from $50 all the way to $1,000. It gets nuts. But don't be overwhelmed, all right? Because this is where the easy part comes in. As you can see, it's kind of like a cascading scale with these squares. The case usually needs to match the motherboard. The motherboard usually needs to match the CPU. As easy as that, right? Because you don't want to get a motherboard that's too small for the case, and you don't want to get a CPU that won't fit on the motherboard. So it matches in how you want it. It's like poetry, it rhymes, right? So you got to focus on what kind of CPU you want. Like, do you want to go with Intel? Do you want to go with AMD? Do you even want to go with a third party somewhere somehow? You got to think about how big you want your computer to be. Like, look at the space that you have. Do you plan on being an enthusiast? All that kind of stuff revolves around what CPU you're going to pick, what motherboard you're going to pick, and then what case you're going to pick. It all just falls into place. So your CPU, at least from my perspective, I would never buy anything that's over $350 for a CPU. Never. You have some enthusiasts out there that will plead up and down, and here's the reason why that you want to spend $350 or less on a CPU. Because one, your more up-to-date CPUs past the $350 range tend to be marginally better. They're never actually like leagues better. They're just marginally better. Like in case you really want to get that extra frames per second. And I mean like really, really etching for like 5 extra frames or something stupid like that. Go for something ultimately that's in your price range. But having a CPU that will last you at least 5 years at $350 is an awesome deal. Awesome. Now the brain, your human brain, it has memories in it, and we're still trying to figure out how the brain works. But ultimately, you have your long-term memory and your short-term memory. Now, your long-term memory is something that you would use with a hard drive. And now I know you've heard this term before. If you haven't, then This might not be a good start for you, but I'll try. The hard drive is where all the really, really, really important data needs to be stored. And I use this term loosely, permanently. It's where all of the it's where Windows is installed. It's where all your games are installed. It's where all of your important files are installed, like your resume and a whole bunch of other kind of stuff. The hard drive stores everything that you need, right? And that's your long-term memory. Your short-term memory is something called RAM. And you're going to eventually, I'm sure if you've, ever looked on the inside of a computer, you're going to see these kind of long skinny sticks, kind of these rectangles just sticking out. That's RAM. RAM, which is RAM, stands for Random Access Memory. This is your short-term memory. This is like you're bringing up on your computer a little bit of information like a web page or something like that, and it's remembering to keep it open. Because if you were to just minimize that web page, then if you didn't have RAM, it would just close it. Hell, it probably wouldn't even open. RAM is going to help your computer function, and it needs RAM. For another instance would be, since I usually talk about video games, RAM is good for remembering textures and models and things like that. Stuff that needs to be remembered for the game to play. So like when you're playing a first-person shooter and you turn, right? And you're viewing a new object, something that has a color that you haven't really seen yet, RAM already had that texture stored and immediately pulled it and then processed it. The rest of the computer processed it with the video card and everything that we'll go over later, and then made it appear on your screen. The random access memory is very important, and at most times you want 8 gigs or more. You never really need more than 8 gigs unless you're a super duper enthusiast, but 8 gigs is a great start. RAM is probably about 30 to 80 bucks. Oh, I'm sorry, I did 20. It's never rounding. Now, I don't know where you can really get it for 30, but I've seen it for 30, and we're talking like out of date. Your motherboard, again, this is one of those things that you need to tie into. The motherboard, whenever you look at it, whenever you look at the statistics for the motherboard that you're buying, it's going to give you what RAM sockets or what's the right size of RAM to get. It's going to tell you that. And then it's also going to tell you what's the right voltage, because having too low of a voltage with your motherboard is going to make the RAM not work so well. Like RAM constantly needs electricity in order to remember things. So when you're buying, I don't know, like 5-volt RAM or something like that, like it's saying, hey, look, the motherboard needs to supply me with this much energy so I can function properly. So always keep your eye on that. The hard drive is usually, geez, these things are cheap nowadays. 20 to 100 bucks. Not that much. Actually pretty cheap, especially for how much space you get. But here's the thing. There's this new type of hard drive that's out, and it's not really a hard drive. It's called an SSD. An SSD is solid state drive. These things are monstrous. These things are awesome. They're worth every penny in investment. They'll make your computer overall faster. A hard drive, in case you didn't know, actually has a spinning disc on the inside. A lot like a really thick, it's like a thick floppy disk. There's actually a moving part in there, and it kind of wears down over time. It breaks down. It just doesn't really meet performance standards these days. And the newer type of hard drives called SSDs, they're a lot like a thumbstick or a USB drive. You kind of just plug it in. There's no moving parts, and it's just a shit ton of memory in a block. and it works faster. There's no moving parts. It lasts longer. It's fantastic. Definitely invest in an SSD over a hard drive, but they still range around in the same price range. So, 100, $120. But I digress. So let's see. So now let's go over this. We got our exoskeleton. We got the heart. We got the spine. We got the brain. We got the short-term memory and the long-term memory. Now, here comes the big one. Muscle. Your computer needs muscle, especially when it comes to playing video games. Now, based off of what we're looking at right here, since most motherboards can just connect to a monitor, what we're looking at right now, you can pretty much just turn on the computer and you can get some functioning and things like that, whatever. But if you actually want to play a video game, you're going to need a video card. And a video card is big. Video cards are usually very big. They extend all the way to the back of the system from where your motherboard is, because your monitor needs to connect into the back of the video card. So they're pretty long. They're about as big as they're almost about as big as your forearm if you're, I don't know, like 5'9", right? So the video card, it's got weight to it, because it has its own heat sinks in it. It has its own fans. It has its own processors. It has its own RAM. It's technically in some ways kind of half of everything that your computer is, except in a chunk. And it's only designated to process graphics for video games. That's it. It's not designed to really do much else besides just make your computer's life easier when it comes to playing video games. Now, these things can run between, oh geez, you have no idea. These things can run between $80 to $1,200, $1,600, and those are the absolute crazy. Look, guys, we use real gold in our video cards kind of video cards. Like, they get absolutely nuts with built-in water cooling and a whole bunch of other kind of stuff. But a video card, you can kind of go cheaper on. A video card should never really be what you build the system around. In fact, I would actually suggest investing more in your CPU than I would invest in the video card, because a CPU goes out of date a lot slower than what your video card is. Your video card in probably 2 years is going to be out of date, whereas your CPU, before it ever really gets out of date, is probably going to be 5 years. So you're looking at this 3-year difference, especially with how much it costs, and you're thinking, I should just really have a good CPU that'll last me, and then by the time that I just need to update my video card, I could just update my video card, and now my system still is up to date. You get where I'm coming from? So a video card, depending on your budget really, should be nowhere between $250 to $350. Don't spend over $350 on a video card. If you do, I'm sorry. Like, you really don't need to do that. You don't. If I don't understand what you're trying to play. If you're really trying to play something hardcore, this video isn't for you. And if you really are trying to play something ridiculously high end with 4K and all this other kind of crap, then sure, go buy a higher end video card, especially if you can budget it. But this is trying to be as basic as possible. Now, the video card requires a system with a specific amount of wattage. Most video cards say that they'll need a system with 450 or more. Most video cards draw a lot of power. So you need to pay attention to how much you're putting into your system. Now, remember when I said that 450 is the minimum? I have 850 in my system, and I think the minimum that I even need right now is 700. I have 850 simply because I don't like worrying about any issues when it needs extra power. In case my system ever needs any kind of extra draw and power, it has it. It's there. So you might want to bump up your power supply a little bit too, depending on what the video card and everything else wants. So if your video card says that it requires 450, and you have a 450, it's probably better if you have like a 500 watt. That way you'll have extra power for when it needs to draw it. Now the 450 is just whenever it needs to be like an idle and play a game normally, but in case it needs extra power, it's going to have it, and that extra wattage is going to be good for the rest of the computer too. Let's see. Now, you don't really need this anymore, but I would still suggest it, and that would be a CD drive. They're super cheap nowadays, like 20 bucks, whatever. They're super cheap. You don't need anything complex. The one I have is actually pretty complex. It was like 65 bucks. 65 bucks. It also plays Blu-ray. It writes Blu-ray as well. So in case I ever need to burn Blu-ray, which I've never had to do, you can. But honestly, a CD drive for 20 bucks, and you make sure whenever that you buy a new motherboard. Let's see, where is it, brushes? Okay. It comes, your motherboard, whenever you buy a brand new motherboard, it comes with cables. Whenever you buy a new power supply, it comes with cables. So let's see. This should have a cable that came with your motherboard. And then you got your hard drive motherboards, and then you also got to connect that to the power. Then you have this connected to there, so then that should also have its own power cord. You got quite a few power cables going to your motherboard. That already has its power. That already has its power thanks to the motherboard. The RAM and the CPU get their power from the motherboard. That's why there's no cables to it. But as you can see, based on this crude illustration, a computer is not really all that difficult now, is it? The only difficult part is making sure that everything that you're buying matches with one another. Now, there are websites out there that actually help with this. There are websites out there, like a good example would be PC Part Picker. It'll let you pick whatever parts you want, make an organized shopping list, and then also tell you if anything's wrong with your setup. Like if one of the voltages isn't right, or the case's size isn't right, because they also keep track of the dimensions on the inside, a whole bunch of stuff. It's a great website. I would suggest using it. This isn't some type of plug or anything like that, but I used it whenever I needed to build mine, and it was just a way for me to organize shopping parts and everything. So whatever. As you can see, building a computer is not really all that complicated. It shouldn't be that complicated. Welcome to the new age. Thanks again. If you have any questions, any concerns, please be my guest. Remember, I was just going over the basics of it. I can always go into more advanced stuff about where you need to buy a whole bunch of fans and everything like that, but I'd rather not. Do not use, I will say this, do not use my crude drawing and information as a ways to build a computer for yourself. Like, don't say, hey, I bought this one RAM and it was a lot more expensive than you said it was. This is just advice. You don't have to take my advice, but don't say, hey, I bought something that was more expensive or cheaper, and then come to me about it. All right. I'm just giving advice. So you guys take it easy. Thank you for listening, and have a good one.